Good morning. Today is Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024. Last October 7th, one of the many jumbled thoughts I had was what I had said in shul on Yom Kippur just a few days earlier. You remember last Yom Kippur was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And I said that here we are 50 years later, and Israel still faces external threats. But the greatest threat is our internal dissension and acrimony. You remember, of course, the arguments over judicial reform, over the other elements that the government was trying to introduce. And I said that was our greatest threat. And on October 7th, just a few days later, I thought how wrong I was with this terrible, barbaric attack from Hamas. It turns out I was not wrong, though not in the way I imagined. I've mentioned this before, but there have been two recent stunning revelations that make this point as clearly as possible. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times published minutes of 10 meetings among Hamas's top leaders starting back in 2021 as they planned the attack that eventually occurred last year on October 7th. For more than 2 years, Yahya Sinwar and the other leaders of Hamas plotted what they hoped would be the most devastating and destabilizing attack on Israel in Hamas's 4-decade history. And they largely succeeded. Now, the Israeli military found these notes in Gaza. The New York Times got a hold of them and verified them, and a couple of weeks ago published them. So what we have now is 30 pages of previously undisclosed details about the way Hamas's leadership works and the preparations that went into this attack. It is both fascinating, illuminating, horrifying, all at the same time. And there's a lot of information there that we need to absorb, investigate, learn from. Among the many findings in this 30 pages of documents is the following. Now, Hamas initially planned to carry out the attack in the fall of 2022, a year earlier. But they delayed the plan in order to try to persuade Hezbollah and Iran to participate. They wanted it to be on the same day, attack from 3 directions. As we know, that did not happen, although Hezbollah attacked the next day from the north, October 8th. And as we know, Iran has been orchestrating all of this since the beginning. But they prepared arguments for why this was the right time to attack. And the notes show that the Hamas leaders said that Israel's internal situation, the turmoil over the government's contentious plans to overhaul the judiciary. You remember how from January of 2023 until October 6th, We were all preoccupied with this subject. Hamas leaders argued that because of that, that was the reason that we need to strike now. Hamas understood that when Israelis are fighting with each other, that is when we are weakest. That is when we are most vulnerable. So that's from the minutes, the notes of the Hamas leaders themselves. This is even more stark. You may remember a woman named Sapir Cohen. Sapir Cohen was kidnapped along with the other hostages on October 7th. She was among those released in November, but she had the experience of being held captive by Hamas for several months under horrible, horrible circumstances. So recently she spoke publicly, and please listen to what she said. Again, she is being held prisoner in Hamas, in Gaza, by Hamas. Listen to what she says. During my captivity, one of my captors called me to watch Al Jazeera, right, the Arabic news station, when they were showing footage of the Hostages Square. You remember Hostages Square is in this area in Israel where people gather to protest in favor of releasing the hostages, to press the government to make an agreement. You remember over many, many months there have been gigantic gatherings. So here's a woman being held prisoner in Gaza, being shown on Al Jazeera television this footage of this gigantic gathering urging the freeing of the hostages. So Sapir says, I saw tens of thousands of Israelis united in purpose, and it filled me with hope. It's pretty amazing. If you're being held hostage and you see these gigantic demonstrations to free you, that could give you a lot of hope, a lot of strength. That's understandable, but listen carefully. The captor, the guard, the Hamas guard, smiled, and he interlocked his fingers into two fists. And he said, when all the Jews are like this, they are strong, strong, strong. We'll wait a bit. There will be chaos among you. And then we will attack again. Those are the words of the Hamas guard. Sapir says, it was then that I understood they were acutely aware of our vulnerabilities. And they know that our greatest threat comes from within. And this remains our greatest threat. Our enemies are waiting for our internal dissension to rise as the best time, God forbid, to attack us again. So, I and many others have spoken about this numerous times, but I worry it gets dismissed. First, because we often repeat platitudes. Be nice. Get along. Jewish unity is important. Don't insult others. All of that's true, but it's just kind of goes in and out, I worry. And also, especially here, right here, I worry that we think that it's others who need to learn this lesson. The people in Israel need to hear this. The people in government need to hear this. It's not directed to us. We're just here in Montreal or wherever we are. And that's wrong. Because it is also us. It is also you and me here who must improve in very concrete and practical ways. And so as we approach the Yartzeit of that terrible attack, the Yartzeit is this Thursday, Shmini Atzeret. Let's review practically some steps that we need to take. And I want to quote from an article written by Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, a great scholar in Israel. He wrote an article in the Times of Israel, Jewish Unity Getting Beyond the Platitudes. So let me quote a bit of what he said. Moving toward authentic Jewish unity requires difficult steps that depend on novel modes of thinking. If we are going to improve, we have to be willing to think differently. Not only act differently, but to think differently. One of the problems that we have, and again, I'm not only talking about discussing Israel or politics, I'm talking about in every area of life, is that each person or each group attributes sinister motives to the other group. If you disagree with me, I assume the worst motive, whatever it is, in the political realm. You don't really care. You're out to get me. You don't care about me. You're insensitive. In the personal realm, you're trying to hurt me. We attribute these sinister motives, and so often they're wrong. So often, the other person, the other side, may have a very valid motive. They express it differently. But as soon as we jump to the conclusion that your motive for your opinion is sinister, it's much easier for me to dismiss you and to demonize you. Very often, many of us act as if we are always right. Whenever there's a disagreement, and again, about major issues, about relatively minor issues, we assume that we're right and the other person is wrong. But let me ask you a question. Let's just be honest for a second. How can you be right all the time? Just statistically speaking. I can't be right all the time. How can anyone claim that? And we do this so often, and then, because we think we're always right, we refuse to acknowledge that we might have been wrong. And by refusing to acknowledge that we may have been wrong, we remove any ability to be able to converse. One of the urgent needs we have today, and this applies to every one of us, is to make admitting mistakes part of the conversation. On all sides, in every area, it should be a normal and easy thing for us to admit, I was wrong. Because the more that I do that, and I recognize I can be wrong, the less I will demonize your position. Every one of us, we need to be careful about our rhetoric, about the words we choose when we disagree with someone. because the words matter, and they very much lead to overheating of dialogue to go into, God forbid, worse things. The government's out to get us. I don't believe any of them. The courts are corrupt. One of the things that I find particularly problematic is how many people, how many Jews are so quick to label someone an anti-Semite because they disagree. They disagree with the position, they disagree with the policy, they disagree with the government action. Yes, of course, there are anti-Semites, and yes, there is anti-Semitism. Yes, there's plenty. Much too much. But not every person who disagrees with me is an anti-Semite. And not every person that disagrees with the policies of the Israeli government is an anti-Semite. And when we do this, again, we demonize the other and make it impossible for there to be any kind of dialogue. If you're just plain evil and a threat to society and an anti-Semite, if everyone is, then there's no way that we can talk to each other. There are those among us, and I think we recognize them, although it may be harder to recognize when we do the same thing, who feel that they have to win every single argument, that they have to always have the last word. And that sets up a situation of constant contention. If we could just approach a situation to say, I don't have to be right in every single detail. Maybe I should concentrate on the issues that are important and let the side issues, okay, we'll compromise there. It's not so important. If we could simply prioritize into which issues are absolutely essential, principle, and then a secondary category is those issues that they're secondary. Whichever way it goes, it's not going to make such a difference. And be able to give in, to compromise on those. It would lead for a much healthier society. This is something that is so, so important, and I feel all too often it gets lost in our society. We should realize when we're talking about issues, again, politics, religion, all kinds of subjects, important subjects, we should realize the positions we have, they're complicated. It's not so simple. And it could be that I, in taking a position, that I'm not right. Because it's complicated. And when things are complicated, we have to recognize, okay, I have my opinion, but I recognize it's complicated. And here's what happens. If I can recognize that it's complicated, I can make room for you to have a different opinion. Because it's complicated. It's not clear. Jewish law is not clear. Morality is not clear. Common sense is not clear in this particular question. And if I could realize how complicated these subjects are, and not be satisfied with a simple answer of certainty, I could recognize, someone of goodwill with motivation that is just as good as mine could arrive at a different conclusion. Internal discord remains our most serious threat to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. Not only because of what it does in tearing ourselves apart from each other, God forbid, but in terms of bringing on the attacks of our enemies, as is absolutely clear now. And so every one of us, we here now, we need to start with practical steps. We need to try to adopt a more moderate tone in our own conversations. Not extremist language, but moderate. I think this is correct. I disagree, without labeling. Every one of us in our own lives, we need to object vociferously to rabbis and leaders who fail to follow these principles, who do speak with overheated rhetoric, who do insist that they are always right and there is no room for opposition, who do demonize anyone who disagrees with their position. We have to object to that. And we need to not follow the media that highlights consistently the most extreme voices. One of the great problems in society today is where we get our news from. And if we get our news from sources that do demonize, that do exaggerate, that do paint the other as sinister and always wrong, it bodes ill for our society. Rabbi Blau concludes by writing, societal attitudes can change, and every transformation begins with a single step. And that is what we all need to do now. My friends, I wish you a great day, a happy Chol HaMoed, a wonderful Yom Tov of Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, understanding that there will be sadness and loss and grief, and there will be joy and celebration and recognition of our strength and our beauty. I hope that it will be an inspiring Yom Tov for all of us, in a fitting memorial to those who died on October 7th and every day since. May their memories be a blessing for the entire Jewish people.